Welcome, good evening. My name is Çelenk Bafra. I'm the Artistic Director of Istanbul Modern. It's a pleasure to gather tonight for a special edition of Museums Talk, our long-standing series. Since its inception in 2012, this program has hosted over 40 museum directors, department directors, and curators, and has served as a platform for dialogue and exchange among museum professionals in Turkey and internationally, and also art enthusiasts to explore current issues in contemporary museology. Through these conversations, we've been aiming to foster international dialogue as well as collaboration and contribute to the contemporary discussions on museums and related practices. Tonight, we are particularly honored to welcome Mr. Taco Dibbits, the General Director of the Rijksmuseum, one of the world's most leading art institutions, cultural institutions. Mr. Dibbits will share insights into the museum's transformation, its vision for the future, and the evolving responsibilities of the museums in contemporary society. I would like to extend our sincere acknowledgements to Mr. Dibbits for joining us tonight, and my colleagues, especially Ümit and Adam, for their dedication in preparation the museum series. This is actually the third talk of Museums Talk from the Netherlands. We started with the Boijmans Museum in Rotterdam, continued with the Stedelijk Museum, and this will be the third one realized with the general support of the Consulate General of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. We hope that this collaboration continues next year with their support, because it provides us a valuable opportunity to highlight the dynamism and innovation of the Dutch museum landscape. And before we begin, I would like to express our gratitude to the Consulate General of the Netherlands, and I would like to invite the Cultural Attaché, Jeff de Boer, to make an introduction. Thank you.
Hello, good evening everybody. First of all, to Istanbul Modern, to Çelenk, Atom, Ümit. Thank you so much for hosting this event, and also special welcome to Taco for coming all the way from Amsterdam to Istanbul to meet and to explore and to discuss, like what we did this afternoon. We hosted an event at the Consulate General to, meet with the peers in the cultural field. That's why we are here. Let me briefly explain why we support museum talks. I think for me, museums play a crucial role in society. They are far more than places which objects behind glasses they shape now. Communities they can identify, and they can check on their history and the future. And as trusted institutes, museums offer spaces to explore different perspectives, and that's really important. They also help us to understand how our stories, your stories, connect with those of other cultures, communities, or countries, such as the Rijksmuseum, showcasing the Dutch connection with the Ottoman Empire. To do this well, museum professionals need to meet and learn from one another, just as what we are doing today. As representative of the Netherlands, we are proud to support initiatives that strengthen cultural collaboration between our countries. With regard to Rijksmuseum, Rijksmuseum is one of the most visited museums in the Netherlands and home of many masterpieces from Rembrandt and Vermeer. Rijksmuseum, under Taco Dibbits' leadership, has embraced an approach that places openness, inclusion, and accessibility at the core of its mission. The museum has taken steps to re-examine its collection, tell more complete stories, and engage with audiences with new perspectives. Today's sessions offers a great opportunity to explore how the Rijksmuseum will stay relevant as a national museum in the coming years. And I believe that it's important perhaps that we can dive into two topics that receive special attention this evening, which are also relevant for Turkish audiences. The first of them is how to engage and interact with younger audiences, ensure that future generations can learn from and appreciate the past. Secondly, what is the approach of Rijksmuseum towards non-European collection, such as the Ottoman artifacts you have in your collection? This is something I had in mind, and perhaps we can dive into those questions. I hope to hear how Rijksmuseum continues to inspire, educate, and connect people for generations to come. So, last but not least, and to all of you here today, thank you for supporting the arts and for being part of this ongoing conversation. Thank you so much. And then I give the floor to Taco.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very happy that you're here tonight. I understand I had to worm my way through this afternoon, police cars and things. So I understand that for some of you it was difficult to get here. I will speak quite a lot about history, because if it isn't from history, what else can we learn from? The Rijksmuseum is the National Museum of the Netherlands, and it is the National Museum both of art and of history. It's in Amsterdam. It's housed in this building, which was at the time when it was built in the 19th century one of the largest buildings in the country, which exemplifies how important the importance of museums in society and how the Dutch wanted to manifest it. It houses collections, art collections, but also historical collections. And our mission since 2012 is the Rijksmuseum unites people, art, and history. And everything we do has the aim to unite people, not only with art, but also with history. And you can imagine this is not always easy, and I will speak about it in a society that's more and more polarized. But it's these works in the end, and I think we have to trust as museum people in the objects that we take care of. It's these works that unite people and that unite also the large audiences we have, over 2.5 million people a year who come to visit the collection. This is by Rembrandt, The Jewish Bride. Another example of the art collections by Vermeer, a woman reading a letter. But also artifacts and art objects that are historical. Here is one of the important Dutch silversmiths from the 17th century. It depicts one of the battles against the Spanish. The Netherlands in the 17th century became independent during an 80 years war of the Habsburg Spanish Empire. And it was a battle of independence, which at the same time during this battle gave great prosperity to the country. And objects like these were made celebrating battles which we won. But also historical objects like this one. This is the mirror, as we call it, of the main battleship of the British fleet, the Prince Charles, which was taken at the Battle of Chatham, which was one of the victories of the Netherlands over the Brits, also in the 17th century. As a young independent country, we were at war to secure trade routes to the east and to the west. This is one of the objects that we have, and of course, like most historical museums, we celebrate the battles we won, and the British, who won far more battles from the Dutch than the Dutch did from the British, they celebrate the ones in Britain. And I remember when the late Queen Elizabeth came to visit the Netherlands at a certain point, she turned around to her security guards and she said, "Come on, boys, you can pack this up and take it back." It also is the historical museum that houses the history of our colonies. This is a painting depicting Diponegoro, an Indonesian prince who was betrayed by the Dutch when sighting on the Dutch side. It's a victorious painting of the Dutch. These stories are also told in the museum. And I will speak about it later, how we deal with that history. But it all started, and here I will give a little history lesson. It all started with Napoleon, who you see on your left. Napoleon sent his brother over, Lodewijk Napoleon, who's the man on the right, when the French occupied the Netherlands. It was around 1800 that Lodewijk Napoleon came over, and he felt that there should be a national museum, like there was a new national museum in France after the revolution. Well, you all know it, but after the revolution, the king, or at the revolution, the king was beheaded in front of the Louvre, which was his palace, and the palace was opened to the public. So that was a royal collection that was open to the public. Napoleon felt the Netherlands should have a capital city, and the capital city should not be The Hague, but should be Amsterdam. And in Amsterdam, in the town hall, he made the National Museum, and he went to live there as well. So he really occupied the town hall. The Rijksmuseum, which then formed, so this was around 1800, was mainly, the collections were mainly formed in the 19th century. And it was formed partly out of a frustration, to show really the independence and the importance of the Netherlands after having lost Belgium. And this might seem like a detail, but it's still every day that I get emails from Italians, from Spanish. We have a Flemish painting. Can you tell us something about it? Well, the Rijksmuseum is not a Flemish museum, that's Belgium, but it really manifested itself as a Dutch museum, which was about the Dutchness of Dutch art. And here we see one of the battles during which we lost parts of the Netherlands to that new country, Belgium. This was in 1830. And it's illustrated by the fact that the Rijksmuseum has the biggest collection of Rembrandt paintings. You see him on the right, Rembrandt as a young man, but doesn't have a collection of Rubens. We don't have paintings by Van Dyck. We don't have paintings by Jan van Eyck or by Bruegel. Those are all artists who are really considered Flemish. And the Flemish were on the side of the Spanish in the Great War of Independence of the Netherlands. So it is a museum that has a very strong national character, and at sometimes nationalistic character. We had the opportunity to build a great international collection. It was William II, who was the second king of the Netherlands. So after Napoleon was defeated at Waterloo, a kingdom was established, a new kingdom, with William I as the first king, William II, whom you see here, who married Anna Pavlovna of Russia, a Romanov. And she had a very expensive taste. The Dutch don't like spending money, we're known for it, we're all very mean, but she had a lavish taste, and she acquired the most amazing paintings and the most amazing collection together with William II. But after the independence of Belgium, the Dutch were quite tight on money, and they decided to sell the royal collections. And here is the auction of the royal collections. This, you have to see this against the background where probably for Turkey at that time, for the Sultan to sell, or if you speak about it now in France, for a country to sell their paintings is the end of the country. In the Netherlands, that's not seen like that. It's a mercantile country, and art is there also to be traded. If we look at our royal collections in the Netherlands, they are virtually non-existent. If you look at the British royal collections, you have provenances from the 16th, 17th century. In the Netherlands, that's not the case. The Rijksmuseum's oldest provenance are civic provenances from the city of Amsterdam. And I will show you later the Night Watch, which is at the center of the museum. That's a painting that is since the 17th century owned by the city. So it's very much a civic museum. In this collection of the king were beautiful drawings by Raphael, now at Christ Church in Oxford. There was a beautiful Jan van Eyck, very rare painter, Flemish, so it could be sold. And there were paintings by artists like Andrea del Sarto. They all dispersed all over the world. This went on to such an extent, this selling of our national treasures, as it was called by critics, that two men put their heads together and they decided something should be done. And we see here Victor de Steurs, who was a historian but also a politician, and Pierre Cuypers, who was an architect. And de Steurs, together with some politicians, decided that we had to stop this selling out of the treasures of the country. And they started in Parliament to rally for a new National Museum. The National Museum was, as I said, first at the palace on the Dam Square, which Lodewijk Napoleon had turned into a palace. And then it moved to one of the houses on the canals when it became the royal palace of the now royal family. And these houses, it was a tiny house, and it was called a storage house because it couldn't house all these Dutch paintings, Dutch artifacts. So a building had to be built. Cuypers, who was one of the people in the background rallying, won the competition. So also in the Netherlands, what you do, you're an architect, you start to gather the money, and people in politics arrange the money, and then you participate at with the competition, and very surprising, you win the competition. So that's how it also happened in the 19th century. And he was commissioned to build the Rijksmuseum. The Rijksmuseum was far too big for the collections that came from one of the houses on the canals, which is basically the same size as one of the towers of the museum. So he decided to decorate this museum with paintings inside. And these paintings had a Catholic, often Catholic iconography. The Netherlands is a country which is predominantly Protestant, Christian, predominantly Protestant, but it also has a Catholic population, it has an Islamic population, it has a Jewish population, so many religions are tolerated next to each other, and the state does not exclude religious communities, so it embraces religious communities. But here, the fact that a Catholic won, so a minority won the competition to build the museum, caused a public outcry. He decided not to build a temple as a museum. Most museums in Europe, like the British museum, are built like temples, referring to the Greek temples, and they should be a temple for the arts. No, he decided to build a kind of mix between a cathedral and a castle for the arts. And the decorations he made inside often referred to very obscure passages of Dutch history, Catholic history. So he built a cathedral for the art. It was meant for the national pride of the country, a country that was frustrated by the loss of Belgium. And it was also a civic institution. So it was born not out of a royal collection, like the Prado or the Uffizi with the Medici, or the Louvre, or most collections in Germany. No, it was like the National Gallery in London or the Victoria and Albert Museum. Looks a bit like it. It was a civic collection. The building was built and people started to donate works of art to the buildings. So the burghers of Amsterdam and of the country started to give works of art. Now there is a very peculiar thing about the Netherlands as well, is that the cities, and especially Amsterdam, as it is the capital city, although the government isn't there, so it's a bit the situation like here that the government is not in Istanbul but in Ankara, the cities are very powerful, and we sometimes speak about they're nearly republics. So the Dutch, the city of Amsterdam, and I tried to once explain this, I had to guide the head of state of France, President Macron, through the Rijksmuseum, and I tried to explain that the museum, but also the night watch, is owned by the city of Amsterdam. And for a French president, that's a complex idea, because the state owns everything. But with us, the city said to the state, when the Rijksmuseum was going to be built, we donate the state the ground you build on, the piece of land. So it's not the state's, but it's the city donating it to the state. And two things we want. One is a museum, and the other one is a entrance to the city. So the Rijksmuseum is, I think, the only museum in the world that has a road running straight through it, because it was meant to be also the city gate. So it's a building, when you see it, that's sometimes difficult to navigate because there's a road running through it, which is now a cycle path. In Amsterdam, bicycles are the same as in the States. With weapons, they're freedom. And sometimes they are nearly murder weapons, because as a tourist you might be surprised by them. But it stands for freedom, and this cycle path has been a subject of much debate during our renovation. We renovated the building, and it is luckily it's open and people cycle through it, walk through it, and it makes the museum a very open building, and I hope also an open institution. But the building was so Catholic that the King and the Queen of the Netherlands said at the opening, we won't come to the opening. So imagine the entire building, National Museum built, they refused to come to the opening, and they said, we will never set foot in this monastery. So it was really an expression of it being too Catholic. So religions are tolerated up to a certain point, and this was too far for them. Here you see the opening event, for which there was a classical music piece written, and at the last moment all the representatives of government were there, but the king and queen were missing. It housed the paintings collections, and here you see the paintings collections, with on the right with a barrier in front of it, the Jewish bride. It also housed, and this is one of the paintings, a double portrait by Frans Hals. It also housed the applied art collections, and it was a daylight museum, so you had a lot of daylight coming in. And this is an example of a Dutch artist, Lambert Domer, with a 17th century cabinet that is decorated with the famous tulips. And I think that's one of the things that unites the Netherlands with Turkey, the tulip trade. But also it was built in ebony. And ebony was, for the Netherlands, one of the special woods that would come from the east. And they were used as ballast in the ships, and it became one of the woods that we exported throughout Europe. Or this beautiful cabinet that was made for Amalia van Solms, so one of the Dutch stadtholder wives, and those were where before we had a kingdom we had stadtholders, which in a sense is very similar, but this was made for her. It houses the print room, and here a beautiful drawing by Rembrandt of a sleeping woman, and the library. And the library is still open to the public. You can all come and visit, and you can also, if you want to see this beautiful drawing by Rembrandt, you can actually ask for it and you can see it. And we feel that it's a very important thing to keep open. It's open also on Saturdays, traditionally, because in the Netherlands Saturday is a weekend, so people who were from working classes could come to the museum and could see the art. The collection in total of the museum is around 1 million objects, so it's a large collection. The library you can now also visit from the balcony, and it's one of the most photographed and Instagrammed rooms in the Netherlands. The building, the floor plan of the Rijksmuseum was very simple. It reflected basically an Italian palace. So even though the decoration, the outside looked like a cathedral, the floor plan was like a Renaissance palace. You had the inner courtyards, and then you have the Gallery of Honor, which is the gallery in the middle, which had side chapels in a sense, where the famous artists of the Netherlands were exhibited. And at the top you see Rembrandt's Zaal, that's where in between two columns at the very end you could see the Night Watch. In a sense, it was one of the best marketing tools, the museum itself, to position the Night Watch as a painting of national pride. It is Rembrandt's most ambitious and most complex composition. It's his masterwork, you could say, but it also represents for the Dutch, and that's why I say a piece of marketing that was really put at the core of the museum. It represents this civic society. It's not where you usually would have on the high altar, you would have in a museum, either if you're in Italy or in a Catholic country, Christ on the cross, or in France you would have Louis XIV. In the Netherlands, it's the burghers of the city. These were the men in the 17th century who were ruling over the city. They were basically, as the ones who are still very powerful now, merchants, lawyers, and pharmacists. The painting itself as a symbol of civic pride, of the burghers who made the museum, who built the museum, and at the axis it was hanging at the far end of the Gallery of Honor, which was to house the Dutch 17th century painting. So really a demonstration of pride and of civic responsibility in a sense. But it was also very imposing. And in the 20th century, the feeling was that it should be democratized. The collections were growing. The the paintings which I was talking about, the murals which were made by Kuipers when the building was still empty and the collections were small. With these growing collections, those slowly disappeared, and in the beginning of the 20th century, they were washed away and paintings took their places. To give an example, when the building opened, there were 700 paintings in the collections, and now there's nearly 9,000. So it really grew a lot. But at the same time, with these growing collections, the building itself was democratized. And this meant that the courtyards were filled in. I don't know if I have here. These courtyards were filled in. All these large rooms, these were, if you remember the plan before this, these were one large room you would have, and also here large rooms, were all kind of split up into small rooms. And here you see it nearly as a kind of parody. It was made into a labyrinth, so nothing should impress. The room should be small, at a human scale, and you would be able to navigate, but often you would get lost in this maze of rooms. So during this process of making the building more democratic, it was also intended to show the collections in a more democratic way. This is the exhibition of the historical collections. The rooms that were exhibited try to imitate period rooms. So this is a room that was constructed in the 1950s, but it should look as a 17th century room. And here you see one of the paintings, the construction of the canal houses in Amsterdam. And all these canal houses were filled from bottom to top with paintings. When in the 17th century these houses were built, it was the new wealth of the Netherlands. The country had become independent. There was trade abroad. The colonies were starting, and the wealth that was brought back went to the people who constructed these houses. They could each buy a plot of land. Here the plots haven't been sold yet, and slowly it would fill up, and these houses would house the treasures that were brought back to the country, but also the treasures that were produced in the Netherlands. A lot of those, through inheritance, arrived at the Rijksmuseum. In the Netherlands, like most countries that were under Napoleon, we have a division always. Every child gets an equal part. That means that all collections are split up, and a lot in the end go to museums or are sold abroad. So it's very different again from the UK, where you have the right of the oldest son and the estates are kept together. The Netherlands is also a very different country because we don't have land. The people who lived in these houses were not landowners in the Netherlands, they were merchants. And all the money they had was invested, always. So they did not really invest in bricks, because if you look at these houses, they are very beautiful, but they're very small if you compare it to the large palaces you see in, for example, Rome. Not having land and being traders, they also had arts that were small in general. And the paintings, we call them easel paintings, could fit on an easel, and they would usually have a size like this. The larger paintings, like the Night Watch, they were commissioned by the towns, by the cities, and they had secular subjects, and also the paintings in these houses were secular subjects. The Catholic artists in the Netherlands mainly emigrated to Italy, because there they could paint commissions, and the ones who stayed started to specialize on cityscapes, specialize on landscapes, specialize on still lifes, all those specialities on genre pieces, which showed, like Vermeer, which showed the interiors of houses. All those specialities were born because there was no commission, no religious commissions anymore. So many of these treasures arrived at the Rijksmuseum, and as I said, the courtyards were built in, and the museum became a maze. So when we decided to renovate the museum, because it had really become worn out, there was a lot of asbestos and it had to close, we decided less is more. So the courtyards were freed up again, and here you see the demolition of them, were freed up again and became the lungs of the museum. It's now a large atrium, and it really gives air to the museum. And the rooms were brought back to their original size. So these rooms had all been built in with small lowered ceilings and small rooms to exhibit the works. You have to imagine again a different time set. This was around 2000, and in 2000 the European dream, like in the first decade of the 21st century, the European dream was very present also in the Netherlands. And if you think about it, at the right you see the architects. There were two Spanish architects. So Rembrandt would have turned in his grave. The country had become independent of Spain in the 17th century. In the 21st century, we invite two Spanish architects to build the national pride. So this was really Europe. And on the left, we'd been under French rule. On the left, Jean-Michel Wilmot, a French interior architect who did the installations of the museum. I couldn't have been happier. I arrived at the museum. I've been for a long time living in the UK. I arrived back in the Netherlands. The museum was about to close, and these men started to work. So in that sense, it was really an international crowd. The Spanish architect said we want to free up those courtyards. We want to give the lungs back to the museum. We see it as a breathing body. The Gallery of Honor, which has all those beautiful paintings hanging on it, should be the aorta of the body, and the night watch, its beating heart. But the building during the 20th century had been modernized and also secularized. So everything, here you see it after the renovation, but this large hall was painted completely white, and on each side at the end an organ was hung. And there were chandeliers. And organs and chandeliers are the only decoration you have, serious decoration you have in Protestant churches. So in a way this Catholic building was made into a Protestant building, helped by modernism, which was all white, and also there were some steel beams added, so it really looked completely different. The only thing that reminded one of its Catholic past were these stained glass windows. You still see them in a lot of Dutch churches. The main reason why they were kept is that the museum never had much money. Everybody was quite stingy, so the windows functioned, but they didn't really have the iconography that people wanted. So as I said, Cruz y Ortiz, the Spanish architects, decided not to go back to the original state of the building, because it was built when the collections were much smaller, but to really go forwards with the architecture. And I think that was a brilliant move. They didn't, usually you see architects fighting against the building when they have to renovate it, but what they said, we take it up to the next generation. They sometimes showed the original building, like here, and this was years of reconstruction, but also restoration. And on the other hand, they made the rooms where the art was shown very modern. Where the museum housed all these collections from the print room, the paintings department, the decorative arts museum and the history museum, the visitor each time before had to start with the history of art again. So every time when you would go and look at the Delft blue ware, you would start very early with pottery, then you would in the 17th century arrive with Delft blue, you'd go to the 18th century, 19th century, and when you would then go to the collection of glass, you would have the same, you'd have to start again. So basically the museum reflected the organogram and the specialization of each curator. So what we decided to do is to make one story, one chronological story, which runs from basically over 800 years of Dutch history. That's more or less the earliest artworks you find, except from archaeology, are 800 years old. So where your country was an entire civilization, we were under the sea and it was mud. So that's to give a kind of perspective to the country. It's a very young country. This is a work of art, what we call still from the late Middle Ages. Then, so you walked on one floor, you have the Middle Ages, then you walk from there to Vermeer and the little street to the 17th century with the Milkmaid by Vermeer. Which is very typical. I was talking about these genre paintings. This is maybe one of the most famous paintings in the 17th century. You see it is a scene of everyday life. And the everyday life, it's a woman, a maid in the dairy kitchen. It's facing the north. And Vermeer made little stories. So it's facing on the north. You see it's the north because there is some what do you call it? Some moist on the plaster, some fungus. She is pouring milk. That's why it's called the milkmaid. She's making a bread pudding. So she has the bread, which is very crumbling, and Vermeer indicated this with dots, which artists before never did. He really feels if you can touch the breadcrumbs, so stale bread, you put it in a bowl, you have beer to make it rise as a yeast, and you pour milk into it. The milk came to her with this little copper can. At the beginning of the day, somebody from the country would arrive into these new cities and would sell you the milk, and they would pour it into this can. The bread basket is hanging, so mice can't get to it that easily. So there's really a small story. You see it's a dairy kitchen as well, because there's a stove, so in here you would have coals, so you could keep your feet warm. You would put it under your dresses, and you would be warm. The Delft tiles that are protecting also the plaster wall. And then I think it's the most beautiful plaster wall, I think, in the world, which has these irregularities. So there used to be a nail here, but it rusted and it fell out, and you still see the traces from it. And we now see it all as kind of, this is normal, it's because we know photography, but nothing is coincidence. It's all a decision what to paint. And to think that this type of painting wasn't there at all before. It really was born in the 17th century in the Netherlands, in this start of a bourgeois household. The British who came were shocked because they saw, and the French as well, because they saw that in the houses the maids would wear more or less the same clothes as the lady of the house, who the lady of the house was basically the manager of the estates. And they would also sit in the same room. So it was in that sense very egalitarian. And the British thought it was absolutely unheard of, and you shouldn't have that. It's been working quite well for the last centuries, but that was really something very different. This is also the 17th century, so this is after the renovation of the museum. And here you see that the rooms were very much modernized, made into exhibition rooms, where Jean-Michel Wilmot decided, and at that time, this was opened in 2012, at that time dark colors for museums were not, you just didn't see it. And he really set a trend, because you now see, especially in the States, you see a lot of museums with dark walls. For paintings, it works very well because your eyes can focus on the paintings, and it also makes the paintings really look as windows into the 17th century. And that was the goal. The goal of 17th century painters was to paint as lifelike as possible. This is a room of early Rembrandt, but we decided in this story in these 800 years of history, to mix the arts and to mix it with history. So you don't only have paintings, you also have pieces of silver. This was made for one of the admirals of the Dutch sea fleet, Tromp. You have the cabinet we saw before. You have one of the important vicars in the Netherlands, Uitenboogaard by Rembrandt. You have Huygens, which was one of the secretaries of state. So you really have a combination of art and history. So as the public, you don't start every time over again. This is the 18th century. In the 18th century, we had international rooms. So on every floor, so on every century, we had the Dutch art, and then we had in the corner room, we had international art. We are now looking again at the installation, because after 10 years, the public has changed, the history has gone on, and I worked on these for 10 years, but I felt that they were slightly outdated, so we have to keep on moving. I think as museums, we continuously have to keep on moving. And one of the wishes is to integrate the international art with the Dutch collections, because the Netherlands is such a tiny country that there is a lot of abroad, and it is more than natural that all these influences from abroad are also shown in the collections, mixed with the Dutch art. The 18th century by Lyotard, who was obviously living also in Istanbul. This is a pastel of presumably his wife. Van Gogh's earliest self-portrait in Impressionist style in the 19th century. So in each century you have paintings but also furniture, and new was the 20th century. The Rijksmuseum had stopped collecting or contemporary art in the 19th century. In the 20th century was for a large part missing. We had historical collections, we had a little bit of photography and some paintings, but over the past 25 years we've been really actively collecting the 20th century and 21st century. Because in the end, as the National Museum, it's strange if you stop, because time goes on and generation after generation should find their home in the museum. This was the opening in 2012. And I'm showing it because at the time, so it was at this time of Europe, but at the time we did not realize that this statement that was made of the Dutch flag, the orange, the Dutch colors. I absolutely love the brass bands, which is also in the Netherlands. Every province and every town has their own brass band. So brass bands came from all over the country to play. At the opening, I was standing next to one of the former directors of the museum. And he had been director in the 1970s, and he had been in a concentration camp during the Second World War, and he said to me, "Isn't it fascinating?" He was an old wise man, and it wasn't a critique, but he said, "Isn't it fascinating that times change? When I would have done this in the 1970s, I would have been very much criticized for being nationalist and building this nationalist image of the museum." At the time we were finished, I heard it, but in 2012, and I thought, well, we've thought about all these discussions, we've now done the best we can, I then, at a certain point, I was sitting down, and the Rijksmuseum was the first museum in the 1970s, in 1976, to make a catalogue of all its paintings with little black and white illustrations. Many museums followed after, but they were the first. And on the first page, I opened it, there was the floor plan with still the courtyards, you can see it here, filled in, so they now don't exist anymore. But on the floor plan, you see only international names. Italy, there's Spain, in the Gallery of Honor. And that was very much followed the national history of being not proud after the Second World War of the country and showing other countries in the Gallery of Honor, where now we have 17th century paintings hanging there. And this thought brought me further as well to think about how do we deal with a more complete history of the Netherlands, and how do we make it really a museum of the 21st century. A lot has changed over the past years. I think we're now 13 years further on, and if you think back, probably you have the same, but in a very different context, and I think in some ways much, completely incomparable, and I can't even start to imagine the situation you live in. But if you think of 2012, you go back in time and you think of where you live now, things can take a huge turn. And I think that also in the Netherlands, with the rise of populism, it is our duty as a museum to talk about to give a more complete view of history, and also to talk about and to address in the museum the darker moments of Dutch history and the more complex sides of Dutch history. But I will talk about that in a little bit, And first we make a small excursion to the Ottoman Empire, about which was spoken. The presence of people, which we called it then, from the Ottoman Empire and the Levant. This is the town hall of Amsterdam. From there, the directors of the Levant were organizing their trade network, which included the Ottoman Empire, and there was always a presence of people from this part of the world in Amsterdam. It's very little studied. I think there's still a lot of research to be done, but you see it on paintings that they were there. And this building is, by the way, the town hall, which the brother of Napoleon chose as his palace. And it's now the royal palace. And still every year when the ambassadors are hosted in the royal palace, there is a speech, and it's also typical Dutch that the king holds a speech in the civic hall. So there is a very interesting relation between our head of state, the king, and the town, which in a sense is embodied by the town hall, which turned into a palace. But anyway, the presence in the Netherlands of the Levant, but also on the other hand, the presence of the Dutch here in Istanbul. This is the portrait of Cornelis Haga, and he was the first, it wasn't called representative at that time, it was called of the Netherlands in Istanbul, and the portrait is from 1612. So the Netherlands, after the UK and France, was the third country to actually have a permanent representation. So this is 1612, and I now jump to the 18th century when Ambassador Kalkoen arrived in Istanbul. This is a portrait of him by Lyotard, again, the one you saw before as well, pastel. And Kalkoen was ambassador from 1727 for nearly 20 years. He was the one who went on an audiency to Sultan Ahmed III, the tulpen, how do you call it, the tulp sultan, as we call it in the Netherlands, and he had his audiency portrayed by Jean-Baptiste van Moor. And that's quite rare. Vermeer he wrote his diaries, which are still kept in the family. So Kalkoen wrote his diaries. He had a very bad journey coming to Istanbul. He writes he was ill, and it took a long time. And when he arrived, he arrived at the Dutch embassy. But as the former ambassador had a gambling problem, he had died, and his wife didn't have any money, and she was renting out the embassy. Just imagine, you arrive, you go to the embassy, it's rented out, there was no money. So I think it was, but off the top of my head, it was the British ambassador who said, "You can stay a while with me." Then when the wife of the former ambassador had left, he and Kalkoen himself was quite rich, so he went to the Palais d'Hollande, and he had Vermeer paint this view over the Bosphorus. So this is painted from the terrace of the Dutch consulate. And in, I think it was September 1727, he went down to the river. He said, "I had quite an early breakfast at 3 o'clock in the morning." Well, I can tell you, for me, that's far too early. I hope to be partying at that time. But he was at 3 o'clock in the morning. He had his breakfast. He went down to the Bosphorus and made the crossing with a boat provided by the Sultan. He did have to pay for it, but it was provided by the Sultan. And he went on his audiency. And the interesting thing is that although it's said that a lot of the rooms the architecture is fantasy, Vermeer was there. And not all the ambassadors would meet the Sultan, who for the Dutch, I point him out, but for you it's probably obvious. He's sitting there on his throne. And Vermeer is presenting his letters at this audience. See, a lot didn't make it up to this point. They would meet with the Grand Vizier, but they wouldn't make it up to the Sultan. He would have to go through different stages, and these stages are recorded in paintings. The Rijksmuseum has over 30 paintings by Vermeer. There's a copy of this painting hanging in the consulate here in Istanbul, and Vermeer later provided to other ambassadors similar paintings. But he would paint out the face of Kalkoen and would put the face of another ambassador. And these paintings were made to really give an insight to the people in the Netherlands what the court of the Sultan was like. And for the Dutch, the court of the Sultan, it was something, and I don't think you can imagine, because you're not Dutch, but they'd never seen something before. The wealth was far bigger than any wealth in Europe. They would also have, he also painted portraits of people of whom we don't have any, and I don't know if I pronounce it well, but this is the portrait of Nef Seherti Damat Ibrahim Passa. So that's his only of the Grand Vizier at that time. That's the only portrait that we know about him. But it wasn't only the visit to the Sultan. He also depicted scenes from everyday life. This is the first day going to school, a girl going to school. There's also a painting of a large bridal charade. So there's all these moments in people's lives that were depicted by Vermeer and that made their way to the Netherlands and are now exhibited in what we call the Turkish cabinet in Amsterdam. And today we spoke about it. There was, for example, a tradition in the first thing he writes in his diary, and I think it's this painting, although I can't see it from a distance, but when you would enter, there would be food on the floor. And there would be many officials from the Sultan's court standing there, and they would have to fight over the food. I think Umed told me that there was one. I don't know where you are. I don't see you. Yeah, in the back. I don't know what it was called. But you still have an expression, I think, in Turkish. Yeah. So that's depicted as well. So there's a lot of insight in the life at the court. There's some paintings missing, like for example this one, that was lost probably somewhere during the 19th century, and through later in the 19th century, this collection came from the Kalkoen family directly to the Rijksmuseum. But there was more presence also in trade. For example, the permanent envoy in Izmir was the Van Lennep family, which is this family, which shows their integration into life in Izmir. They were tradesmen, and they would have their trade going from the east, going to the east and going to the west from Izmir, and providing also Turkey with a lot of spices that came from the East Indies Company. And this is a recent acquisition. You have to imagine that the wife of Van Lennep she made this whilst staying in Izmir. So it's also a document of the production that was done by the family in Izmir itself. And then, of course, we have the first image of Ankara, which we have given on long-term loan since 2018 to the Koç Museum in Ankara. And I just was given a beautiful children's book about this painting, and it belongs there. So in a sense, we felt as the Rijksmuseum it should be in Ankara. And I was speaking to the director today, and we are confident that it can stay there for a long time to come. So in a sense, the way that this painting has now a new life in Ankara and has a social function there as well, we're very proud that we can contribute to it. Now a completely different subject. We felt that in the installation that we made around 2012, and it opened around 2012, we told the story of the objects we have in the museum, but it's not the entire story. And we want to give a broader sense to the public of what the history of the country is. It is a complex history. It is a history with nice sides and, as you see here, awful sides. And we decided for historical exhibitions to address subjects which we feel are relevant to today, for today. So we want to put them on the agenda. And I think as a museum, you have the power to put things on the agenda, and it's your duty to put things on the agenda. And it's also a duty to keep on telling that history is complex. It's not like populists want us to believe a very simple story where we should just all go back to yesterday, because you can't go back to yesterday. The world turns in one day. You will have to go forwards, and you will have to go forwards together in a country. And in the Netherlands, that's a very important issue, because there are a lot of people in the Netherlands who have roots in the former colonies. So to understand each other better, we felt we should organize exhibitions that deal with these issues. And like every person, I mean, we all are complex and we all have nice and bad sides, and it's all in us. Also, it makes us more complete as human beings. And I think a museum becomes also more complete as a museum. So we organized an exhibition on slavery, the first national museum to organize such an exhibition, in which we decided to give faces to 10 people, because slaves are anonymous in the Netherlands, and we should give them a face and also make them the new heroes. Instead of saying we have to get rid of the old ones, you put new ones next to it. So for example, this is a painting which shows one of the plantations, which was the plantation of Wally, one of the slaves who came into or revolted against the Dutch, and he was killed by the Dutch after a law case in the 18th century. And we gave Wally a face. We told his story. We showed the images of the plantation. So we did represent him, and now he has a permanent place in the museum. It went together with a recognition of and the excuses of slavery. This is our king at the exhibition. He opened the exhibition live on television, and in a sense, in the sequence of events, he made his excuses, and then after, our Prime Minister made formal excuses, and the exhibition itself was then asked to travel to the United Nations. And in 2023, this is the General Assembly, in 2023 it was the first time that a museum was given an afternoon and also an exhibition at the United Nations in their entrance hall on a subject, and this was to commemorate the abolition of slavery. So you can, as a museum, if you address a subject, you can have, and you hope to have, a much larger meaning than the meaning only in your own country, but also the meaning outside and the significance outside of your country. We were, in a sense, slightly naive, because we thought slavery is important for the Netherlands, that people understand each other. But of course, slavery was global. It's a global issue, so it also attracted global attention. And now the exhibition is traveling already. It has traveled to over 30 representations of the United Nations worldwide. So it is, and in every country, people can add one story from their country. Another exhibition, another historical subject which we found important to talk about is the war for independence of Indonesia. Indonesia was a Dutch colony up to 1945 when it declared itself independent, but the Netherlands held on to the colony after the Second World War up to 1949. And it was a war that was just after the war in the Netherlands that was fought with losses on both sides, but with a huge loss in comparison to the Dutch on the Indonesian side. And we felt it was important to tell a more complete story. We'd always been looking at it from the Dutch side, but to also tell the Indonesian side. And it was organized by 2 curators from Indonesia and 2 curators from the Rijksmuseum. It was during COVID, so they were on Zoom calls the entire day because they all had to be in their own countries. But it became an exhibition also that was coincided with research conducted by the Dutch state in the violence of the Dutch during the War for Independence. And it's more recent than the slavery, colonial slavery, and it was very much discussed in the Netherlands. And it was, on the one hand, wonderful that the state, because the Rijksmuseum is still seen as the state museum, although it's privatized, but that the state gave us the possibility to do it. But we were at the middle of a social media fight, as you could call it, with, of course, the threats and the death threats, and everything was included because that's how social media functions today. But we kept saying we have to tell the whole story, and we have to show the complexity of the story, because most people in the Netherlands have a history with Indonesia. And it's important to tell the complexity of that history. Instead of 10 personal stories, in the exhibition we told 27 personal stories. And that might also indicate the complexity of all the different religions, all the different parties that were involved in that war. We showed part of the up to then secret archives of the Dutch state, where for a lot of Indonesians it was emotional because they would find information about family members of whom they didn't know where they'd gone, but also gave information about the political past, that they'd been under surveillance by the Dutch during that period. So it was also a very emotional moment for a lot of people. I'll skip this one. And this emotional moment, I think that when you address these subjects as a museum, you have to be prepared with what comes to you as well. So there was, on the one hand, a lot of empathy of people saying, fantastic, you do it, but also a lot of anger. And we noticed that once we were able, we decided to deal with each email or each shouting charade on the telephone or complaints by people to reply to them and to address them. So we had a team set up who would sit on the telephone and talk for hours. And usually there was anger, but then people, once they told their story, because usually they said, my grandfather fought in the war and it should still be part of the Netherlands, etc. And then when they had told their story, we would say why we staged the exhibition, and they would often say, well, I don't agree, but it's okay. So you create the space, and I think it's already a battle won when it's okay, when people tolerate it. Another part of the museum's task is that we do research on objects that were colonial booty. So this is a cannon from the Kingdom of Kandy in Sri Lanka, and we did research on this object also together with researchers in Sri Lanka, and the Dutch state decided to restitute it. and it's now in Sri Lanka again, where it has a new history and it tells a new story. I'm coming towards an end. So next to these exhibitions on history, we also stage exhibitions on great art, often in an international context. And the most successful one over the past years has been the Vermeer exhibition. We had the rare opportunity to gather nearly all the Vermeers all over the world in the Rijksmuseum. It became a huge success with over 700,000 visitors in 3 months. Not to be arrogant, but we could have had 2 million visitors. And in a sense, it's a great thing, but it also shows the working of Instagram and social media. If you reach a certain tipping point, every algorithm of people who like art goes over that point. Where we have beautiful exhibitions, you really are all invited to come, that don't reach this tipping point. And I think that's the difficulty also for smaller museums. You stage things, but they don't become visible. So I think that's something that we really have a task also as museums, but trying to find ways that things are shown and that the public is aware of them in a world that has, we all thought great internet, but basically it has limited our choices hugely because we all go through the same funnel. So I think there we are doing now a lot, trying to work with AI to broaden that funnel again, so we can show more than only Rembrandt and Vermeer. But it was a wonderful exhibition. Then I will finish with just something on our acquisitions. We do about 1,500 acquisitions a year. That sounds a lot, but a lot of that is photography and works on paper. The largest acquisitions we did over the years were these double portraits by Rembrandt. And if it's about, they were acquired from the Rothschild family, and if it's the Rijksmuseum and Rembrandt and the Rothschilds, and it becomes political. And this became, in a sense, a diplomatic challenge, where the Netherlands had the paintings were in France and the Netherlands had the export license. They had to buy, the intention to buy both paintings, but when they did it, we did it all quietly. And we raised the money, but at the moment when the French felt, oh, but these paintings are leaving, and there was an outcry in the French press, as I said before, for the French, if art is sold, that means the end of the power of France. But then it's sold to the Netherlands. It was even written in the papers, this small country. So then a diplomatic solution was found where both countries have one work. I said, but they're married, so when they've been married for 400 years, you can't split them. So the beautiful thing is, and that's I think also the power of art, that a treaties was made. Usually treaties between countries are about weapons, roads, airplanes, and things like that, but this is a treaty about art. So they always have to stay together and be exhibited either in the Louvre or in the Rijksmuseum. And in a sense, this what we first saw as kind of difficult and a loss as a museum, it became a fantastic collaboration with the Louvre. And then when we had acquired these, and it was a lot of money, 160 million euros, which was the largest museum acquisition of a museum in the world ever. So it was really, and it came to Parliament, and it became a very political thing to spend this money. And then when we presented them, the lawyer of the family came and he said, yeah, you once told me that the really beautiful Rembrandt is this self-portrait by Rembrandt. And we said it would never be sold, but actually there might be a possibility. So after the country had just spent this enormous sum, I had to go to the Prime Minister and say, well, there's another Rembrandt. And he kind of said, yeah, that's okay. Just wait a while. And he then said, and that's also the difference between countries, he then said, you have to find support for it. So go and talk to the political parties, and it's a small country, so the people are quite easy to reach. Talk to them, and to make a long story short, we always kept the French in the loop, so they didn't have the surprise. And in the end, the Netherlands was able to acquire this work for more or less the same as the other two portraits. And it was it was at the moment just at the end of COVID, and people wanted something positive, and it now hangs together with the other works in the Gallery of Honor. And once it's there, and now it will be there for hopefully hundreds of years. And I think it's something to remember that people, what I learned from it as well personally, is that people want ambition, they want to dream, they want to think about things. So you have to sometimes be bold, and it was completely impossible before. The most expensive work of art the Netherlands had ever bought was about 30 million, and this was suddenly 160 million. So it seemed impossible, but it became possible through talking and having people join forces. And then in the end it was privates, the state, and also some companies who contributed to it, and it made it possible. So basically what I would say is I hope I gave an impression of how we move and how we have to keep on moving. The works of art often stay the same, except from the ones being made now, but the public changes, and I think we all the time have to adjust to the publics. And it's important also to think that, as there are probably a lot of museum professionals here, you are the professionals. It's always said, oh, you're so far away from the public, you don't know. But I think that in general, museums know the public much better than they think they do. So I would trust your feeling and go the right way. Thank you.